my dear friends. I am indeed greatly honored to have been invited to participate in the dialogue of civilizations and to present this keynote address at this Culture of Nonviolence session. This is my first participation in this very, very important dialogue, and I offer my sincere thanks to all those, particularly Professor Marietta Stefanians, who arranged this invitation for me. The topic of my talk today is about Tolstoy, Gandhi, and the legacy of J.C. Kapoor. To me, as an Indian, it filled my heart with pride to see how much has been said about J.C. Kapoor yesterday at the very spectacular opening of this conference, as also this morning. So I won't speak too much about him because his great contribution, particularly to introducing Gandhi into this dialogue of civilization, is a very major one. Now, before I come to my talk, I would like to mention two things, two very important facts which have been missed in all that has been said hitherto. The two important facts are the following: that in the last century, we, modern civilization, has killed almost 100 million people in the two world wars, Hitler's gas chambers, and all the other India, Pakistan, Israel, Arab countries, the Iran-Iraq war, etc., etc. It's a terrible statistic. Almost 1 million people killed every year in the civilization, in this century. The first part of it, most of it, of course, was in the first half of the century. Now, in the second half, political geography has been changed more in those years than in all of the rest of many centuries, all through non-violent revolutions of Gandhi. When India became independent through non-violent struggle and joined the United Nations, it was the 54th member in the United Nations. Today, there are 193. So all the other countries have become independent after India. Of course, some of them have used violence, but the vast majority of them became independent non-violently. When an unarmed people learn that even they can force their oppressor to the negotiating table and get him or her or whoever is involved at the top to make a mutually acceptable agreement, they have learnt a very great lesson. And amazingly, Gandhi was operating, as already been mentioned, he was first in South Africa, later he came to India. Much of his work in non-violent struggle was taking place exactly at the time when fascists were ruling Europe, generally considered the vanguard of civilization. In the Second World War, to get rid of three dictators, Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo, more than 50 million lives were lost. In all the non-violent struggles, which brought down all the communist dictatorships of Eastern Europe, which ended apartheid in South Africa, which gave Philippines the first woman president, which ended the Pinochet dictatorship, which put an Aymara Indian as president of Bolivia, and put a black president in the White House. The figure doesn't even add up to 50,000 people. People have lost their lives. Now, this is the main thing about non-violent struggle and what we might call the culture of non-violence. Now, all that Gandhi did was based on two words: truth and non-violence. And if you look at all our modern problems, you will find that nearly all of them emanate out of one single fact. The man at the top doesn't speak the truth. There's a whole new profession called the spin master, who puts a spin on truth. He makes untruth appear like truth. And then it is marketed very smartly all over the world. Now, for Gandhi, truth meant justice, and non-violence meant love. He wrote Hind Swaraj in 1909, and he wrote it, as he himself stated, in answer to the Indian school of violence, because he was horrified. He met young Indian nationalists, deeply motivated by patriotism, who thought that they could get the British out of India by shooting, Britishers in various parts of India. They even shot one of them in London, and this is what greatly upset him. So he has written this book, which is a great critic of civilization. Some years later, in fact, when he was asked what he thought about Western civilization, he said it would be a wonderful idea, as if it didn't even exist, because he didn't consider that a civilization because it was completely devoid of spirituality. Now let me come to Tolstoy and Gandhi. Tolstoy, as he writes in his various books, particularly My Confession, he says that for the 50 years of my life, I was a nihilist. A nihilist in the sense that he didn't believe at all in God, though he was brought up in the Christian tradition. And he has achieved great fame with War and Peace and Anna Karenina. In fact, some of the other Russian writers are complaining now that some Russian writers who are senior to him, that he's getting paid more than them, and they are very upset about it. But then he has lived until 1881 in his country estate, Yasnaya Polyana. Then he comes to Moscow for the sake of the education of his children. There, for the first time, he is, I think, asked, and he accepts, to participate in the Moscow census of 1881. For the first time then, he discovers the state of the urban population. The complete deprivation when there was so much of the smart life in the elite classes. He also discovered that these people were so oppressed, sometimes for stealing a loaf of bread, they would either get thrashed or they would get hanged. But then he also noticed that despite all this, they had a very deep faith in God. And they accepted death almost gladly. This is what got him started. He began to look at religion, at theologies of religion. Incidentally, he had met a Buddhist monk at Kazan when he was in a hospital. He has fought in the Crimean War. Gandhi also fought in 2 wars. Their early lives were so military action. But then he got also interested in what he called Eastern philosophy. In 1995, an Indian admirer of his, who living in New York, sent him a book about Swami Vivekananda. He was deeply inspired by it, and his biographer Birukov has written him that in his diary he wrote, "I, the limited, am part of the unlimited, and the unlimited is part of me," which is a very, very deeply Indian philosophy, reduced in 3 words, Tat Tvam Asi, which means thou art that. That all that we see around us is part of the manifestation of the supreme energy. And what we call the soul inside us is a little bit of that energy. So he gets now deeply spiritual, not religious, and he has found Christ. And he has found Christ as love. Now, Gandhi also was deeply inspired by Christ. He called him the greatest satyagrahi the world has known, the greatest non-violent warrior the world has known. But Gandhi got something else from Christianity. He, on his way back from the Round Table Conference, he stopped in Rome. He went to the Sistine Chapel, and there he saw a crucifix. And he has written that it is there that I saw that redemption comes through the crucifixion, that nations also must learn to undergo deep suffering, that joy comes not from inflicting suffering on others, but upon oneself. He believed so much that there was a divine spark in everyone, even the most wicked. In fact, he wrote a letter to Hitler as my dear friend. A lot of Jews were very upset about it, but he said, well, even in Hitler, there is a divine spark. and one must try and ignite it. That was the whole approach, that all of us are imbued with a divine spark and that we should nurture that spark. Amazingly, his satyagraha means firmly adhering to truth. But I give it a slightly different interpretation. I call it to confront with the truth. Gandhi is normally presented as a great sort of a pacifist. Gandhi was not a pacifist. He was a militant, but he was a non-violent militant. The whole technique was to force your opponent to the negotiating table. And you keep confronting him in whatever way you can, either individually or by rousing the masses to force him to the negotiating table. He also said that non-violent struggle is not a program for seizure of power. It is an effort to bring about a change of relation, a transformation of relationship, to make your enemy your friend. The Abraham Lincoln had said something to that effect about 100 years later. The best way of getting rid of your enemy is to make him your friend. That was Gandhi's great approach. What he has done in India is fairly well known. The way he roused all his people, using simple language, using simple issues that they could understand, cotton and salt. And he led the great salt march, and it was so successful. The New York Times wrote that Britain lost America on tea, now it is losing India on salt. In fact, some historians have said that India became free actually at the end of that salt march because Britain lost control. It was illegal to make salt, and all over the country, wherever people could get to a seashore, they would make salt and sell it. So that is the whole thing about non-violent struggle. It is the power of the powerless, as Václav Havel so well described. And using that power, in so many countries all over the world, people have brought about radical political and social change. Much has changed in the world, but sadly, much still remains very, very unsatisfactory and very, very dangerous. 9/11 is an amazing cataclysmic event. 18 people, who incidentally belong to two countries who are closest friends of the United States in that part of the world, have used US flying schools to learn how to fly, US airplanes, US gasoline, US airports, to destroy its most valuable assets, all 1 hour of a bright, sunny September morning. It has changed the entire scenario of war. All the air forces of all the armies, navies, air forces of the world, all the spy satellites of a superpower couldn't prevent this from happening. Why did they do this? Because of hate in their hearts. So if we really want to improve security, we have to reduce hate from people's hearts. We have to reduce doing the things that create hate in people's hearts. And sadly, the most amazing and outrageous thing, it seems to me, that the UN was set up to prevent the scourge of war on the face of this beautiful earth of ours. In that, there is a Security Council, 5 permanent members, 3 of whom are involved in going around. First, they get themselves a right to protect resolution, apparently to create a no-fly zone. And they make use of that resolution to bomb all the radio stations, TV stations, so on, so anyone that speaks for the man whom they want to change. They even, in Libya, destroyed the best irrigation system that that country had built up. Gaddafi certainly was a dictator, but the only people who have a right to get rid of him are his own people, no one from outside. Libya has been destroyed. Iraq, 2 members of the Security Council, in open defiance of the Security Council, with a coalition of the willing, went and bombed that country. They thought it was a 2-week job. In fact, the president landed on a great aircraft carrier and said the end of all combat operation. 11 years later, or 12 years later, it still isn't finished. It is the longest war, more than the 2 world wars put together, that is going on. It has cost a superpower $3 billion. And still they want to go bombing other people. It's very good, of course, for the arms lobby, but it's not good for the world. Just yesterday, President Obama spoke in the United Nations about America's responsibility to bring peace and order in an unsettled world. First, they unsettle the world, then they talk about bringing peace and order in the world that they have unsettled. That is the tragedy. I believe the most important thing we need to do today is to bring about a reform of the Security Council, where the veto power of these permanent members who dominate the world and do whatever thing they want. Regime change now has become as common as, speaking about the weather. But this means mobilization. This means getting people together all over the world. And one of the organizations that is doing it successfully, that I believe that all those of us involved in the dialogue of civilization need to look at, is at the World Social Forum. The number of people, it all is just 10 years old. It started Puerto Alegre. They meet annually. Now the gatherings have become so large, in fact, they can't quite hold them in one place, so they are holding them in different locations. But in the last major meet in Tunis, there were 2,500 NGOs and 50,000 people who participated. And they are organizing, through internet, which is one wonderful facility that we have, to mobilize people. As of now, they are still not talking about the United States. The main opposition is against global capitalism and the multinational. But I believe we need to network with them to see to what extent we can get them also to develop a political agenda, because this is what we need. Many of the most major problems of the world come from the political domination of just 2 or 3 countries who have veto powers in the United Nations. But I'd like to end. My paper was prepared for a 30 or 40-minute presentation. Obviously, I can't, but for those who are interested, I have copies to give out to you. But I would end by mentioning another important aspect, which has not been touched upon hitherto, either in this dialogue or in earlier dialogues, and that is the role of spirituality. There was a very important, there was a very enlightened UN Secretary General called U Thant, and he had firmly believed that world peace would come only when there is a great spiritual renaissance in the world. So he learned that there was an Indian spiritual master in New York. Amazingly, this person had worked with me in the Consulate General. No one knew who he was, he had just arrived, called Sri Chinmoy. He invited him to come and give meditation classes in the United Nations. He went there, and from that global platform, Indian meditation techniques have traveled all over the world. They're called Peace Meditations at the UN. They have now little groups all over the world. And I visited, in my travels, I go and visit them, speak to them, and they're greatly sort of encouraged by this. And he had a simple message, that world peace will come when the love of power is replaced by the power of love. And I believe that so much. All of Christianity can be summarized in one sentence. Love one another as I have loved you. But what you see all around is hate. Great attempts are being made to bring all the religions of the world together. But the sad thing is, every religion in some way believes that that is the only true path or the best path. Now, for me, one of Gandhi's great contributions was, he was a devout Hindu. But he said, my religion is something that transcends Hinduism. It has to rise above religion, because all religions are like paths up the mountain. Each path, whoever takes one path, looks at that view, the eastern view, and thinks this is the best view of all. One who takes the western view thinks that is the best view of all. But when you get to the top, you find it's the all-inclusive view, which is the best of all because it includes everything. So the effort, I believe, is to get to the top of the mountain and not to quarrel about which route is better. That's the tragedy. Every religion preaches truth and love, humanitarian service, and yet we have been killing each other, saying that my profit is greater than yours, instead of focusing on the Father in heaven. Now, I believe, therefore, spirituality has an important part to play, and no one has made a greater contribution than His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I have, in fact, told him, I happen to know him well, because for 5 years I was president of the India-Tibet Friendship Association of South India. There are 50,000 Tibetans who live in that area, in Tibetan settlements. And I told him this. I said, Your Holiness, you know, the invasion of Tibet, as you call it, was a great tragedy for the Tibetan people. But there is a silver line. It is because of this invasion, as you call it, you and a whole lot of others have been forced onto the world. And for the first time in many centuries, the world is hearing again the message of the Buddha, of compassion. Left to yourselves, you were not really worried about the world. You were happy in your own little Shangri-La. And I see a sort of a similarity. The fall of Constantinople was the greatest calamity to Christendom. But out of it was born the Renaissance. And I see, honestly, with what has happened in Tibet, that there will be a great new spiritual renaissance. And I believe we need it. We need it desperately. The great tragedy of the world is there's too much of religion and too little spirituality. And we can all develop that. And Gandhi was deeply spiritual. I'm a much better Christian. I'm a Christian and Catholic after reading Gandhi, I must say. And all of us who are Christians, I believe, owe a great debt of gratitude to him, because he is the first one to show that the Sermon on the Mount is actually livable in practice, that the meek will inherit the earth, that the peacemakers will be called the children of God. Martin Luther King described him as the greatest Christian the 20th century produced. With these words, I shall end here. I thank you for your attention. Those of you who are interested in the full text of my talk can get it from me.